Hello, and welcome to Senior Code Review Buddy. My name is Chris, and today I'm going to talk about the current state of my Deliberate Practice app. I'll give you a brief look at the app itself, talk about how the process to get that working MVP went, and what I'm thinking about for the next version. Let's dive right in and see what it currently looks like. As I'd mentioned before, I wanted my MVP to be as small as possible to start, so it is just a command line interface. So let's start it, and we can run in either practice mode or evaluation mode. Let's start with practice mode. Let's say I practice a few times. Yes, we'll keep practicing. Say I got a little better, and we'll say I was great that time, and we don't want to practice anymore. And it exits, which makes sense as we're done practicing. Now we'll run it again, and we'll see what evaluation mode looks like. Yep, and evaluation mode is just printing the results from the practices I just did. It's just a basic summary. And that's it. It's a very basic but functional MVP. I'd aimed for a functional MVP because I wanted to use it for my piano practice routine. So, have I been using it and figuring out what parts of the app to improve next? No, not at all, and it's kind of for a reason I expected. I don't find this interface compatible with how I practice piano. My piano is in a room that doesn't have a computer in it, and there isn't a convenient spot for a laptop. So I can't easily use this command line interface while sitting at the piano. So I've just not used the app. So while I've got a functional MVP, I'm not using it. I think I've got a clear purpose for V2, to make this interface compatible with my use case. But before I commit to that idea for V2, let's briefly touch on how the coding process went. In my previous video in this series, I'd walked through an initial design doc I made for V1. And as I worked on V1, I made some changes, and I decided to record those changes in this new document, V1 Implemented. That way, because I referenced the original in my previous video, it will stay in sync with that. Generally though, I would always recommend changing your original copy. Don't make a copy like I have done here, because that can make it hard to figure out which one is your source of truth. So I'll link both of the documents in the description below, so feel free to take a look at them. In this version, I have highlighted the changes from the original document in green. So as we go through, you can see there's not too much that happened in the first part. Just a few small changes, but when we get down here in the tech stack, there are a lot of changes. I'll admit, I probably got carried away here and probably spent more time adding new tools than I should have. When I was setting up the profiles for some of the initial tools I had, I learned about other tools that sounded helpful. So I added Pylint, I added Bugbear, I added Rough, and I added a couple of other Flake 8 plugins. And while I do think I was drawn in a bit by the shiny tool syndrome, I also do acknowledge that it's easier to add new tools and rules when the codebase is small. At least that's the justification I told myself. I spent some time figuring out how to best run all of these tools and tests locally and on GitHub. Thought about using CircleCI for this, but as the name indicates, it's not really intended to be part of a local flow. Reminder here for me to investigate tooling a bit more before I assume it can do everything I want. I ended up selecting Precommit to handle running most of the tooling locally and as a GitHub check. I wasn't able to get Pylint to work with Precommit on GitHub, so it's run as a GitHub action. I still kept CircleCI, but all it does now is run the tests as a GitHub check. Of these various tech changes I made, only one of them had a major impact on my work, and that was my decision to keep the missing docstring warnings enabled. As I started coding, I'd initially decided I was going to disable missing docstring warnings. I'm a fan of good comments, but I've generally felt that requiring docstrings results in a lot of docstrings that are basically just repeating the function, method, class, or file name. They're just repeating obvious stuff, and they don't add any value, and they take time to write. But as I was going through the code, I thought a bit more about that. I thought about how in some of my previous personal projects, having better documentation would have been really helpful later on. Sure, they usually felt like they were slowing me down at the time, but later on, I usually find myself wishing I'd spent a little more time providing useful documentation. Things that seemed so clear at the time get forgotten a year later. So I figured since this was a new project and I wanted to encourage good habits, I should try and stretch myself and leave the docstring warnings on. I could still change my mind and disable the warnings later, or disable them for certain cases where I didn't think they were going to add any value. And now that I've been forcing myself to write docstrings, what are my thoughts? Well, first off, I'm really glad I'm making myself do it. I think it's actually helping me to produce better code. Multiple class names improved because when I was writing out their docstring, I realized the current name didn't make sense, and I had a better idea based on what the class was doing. And there was also a case where it helped me realize that a class was doing too much, and it actually should be two classes. So forcing myself to write these docstrings has been a great forcing function for me to look at the name and the purpose and see if it really makes sense. It's harder for me to ignore mismatches like that when I have to write a string about them. I do think it has slowed me down in the short term, but I'm confident that it's helping me to produce better code, and it will hopefully save time in the long run. There have been a few instances where docstrings haven't felt useful, and I have mass disabled them in a few cases, like requiring every test function to have a docstring. So that's where I'm at with the Deliberate Practice app. So where do I go from here? What does the next version look like? I think the focus of the next version needs to be what I talked about at the beginning. It needs to be getting the app into an interface that I feel comfortable with using while I'm sitting at the piano. So for V2, I want to have something that I can run on my Android phone so I can use this while I'm sitting at the piano. I think there are roughly two paths I can take to do this. I could serve a small web page from my machine, or I could create a mobile app. I want my computer and my phone to share state, so if I wrote a mobile app, I'd also need to write something to handle syncing that state with the computer. That seems like it's going to be more work in total than just serving a basic web page from my computer, so I'm going to go with the web page option for now. That's the only decision I've made about this so far, so I'll look more into it now and figure out what exactly I want this to look like and what new libraries, if any, I'll end up using. Thanks for going through all of that with me today. Do you agree with my choice of starting with a basic web page for V2? Would you have started the mobile app, or would you have done something else? Let me know in the comments below, and please feel free to take a look at the code in the GitHub repo. I've got a link to it in the description below. And if you have any questions about this episode, the app, the code in the repo, please leave a comment below, or you can reach me at chris@seniorcodereviewbuddy.com. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button below and subscribing. Thanks, and have a great day.